Yes, so thank you for the introduction and really glad to be here back in Florence again. So I'm György Kovács and I'm here to talk about our experiences with TeachBack. But what I find really interesting to talk about is first teaching experiences. So I can only really speak about my experience, but my hope is that in some way you will all be able to relate to it. So for me, it was 2 years ago that I got responsibility for a whole course. It was Introduction to AI. And it was actually quite stressful for me. During my PhD, I was traveling a lot, so I got very few teaching opportunities. Here and there, some lab sections. So then after PhD, just a few years, I was responsible for the course, videos, lectures, practical exercises, oral exam, a lot. So the fortunate part was that it was mostly an adaptation of another course. So we already had some materials with PowerPoints. And what I did, because of my nervousness, I was studying those PowerPoints a lot. I was reading a lot and thinking about how could I teach these things? How could I explain these things to the students? And I was spending a lot of time with probability. And when I was thinking about these things and ordering the equations around, I had these realizations that, but this is a way that I hadn't really thought of the Bayes theorem before, for example. And then when I was talking about conditional probability, trying to explain it to the students, thinking about ways of how they could understand the difficult difference between conditional probability and prior probability, I was again arriving to these revelations of, well, this is based on this now, I will be able to recall this better. So actually, after preparing for the course and after teaching the course, I had the feeling that now I understand all these things better, and I will remember these things better. And I was thinking, okay, this is what I would want. So I wouldn't want the students to just sit there and listen. I would want students to have the same experiences essentially. But unfortunately, at the time, I didn't really have the concepts for it. I didn't really see how I could implement it until last year. I came to this conference in Florence, a similar conference, the same building actually, just 2 rooms below, 2 rooms ahead there. And I was hearing then about this concept of teachback. And I thought, now I have the concept and I have the literature as well. So I can go to the program responsible, I can go to the chat professor that we have, and I can just say, this is what I would want to implement in our course. And because of that, because of this backing, we accepted the idea, and that is what actually we did. We started the implementation. So what I would like to talk about here is how we did this. So to give you a small overview, I will talk a bit about the course as the background, the Introduction to AI course, and I will also talk about teachback, how we implemented it, and how we were planning to evaluate it, in what methods we tried to use in evaluation. And after that, I will talk about the results of that evaluation and how we plan to move forward. So what are the future directions for us? So Introduction to AI, the course that I was responsible for, had an audience, a very specific audience of first-year students in a shared master, so coming right away from high school, and they were in the applied AI program. So it meant that for 5 years, they would learn a lot about different things in AI. And so Introduction to AI was essentially, as the name also suggests, an introductory course to it, a lot like a tasting menu. So we go through knowledge representations and probability, logic, all up to deep learning, robotics, and these very complex concepts. And we only had 8 weeks for it because of the university working in these quadrimester systems. So because of that, we had to be very efficient and very organized and structured. So in the course, we designed it in a way that we had flipped classrooms, so to be more efficient. We had a modular setup with 5 modules for the 8 weeks, targeting different areas. And we had very structured ways of organizing the activities. So first, the students would just prepare by themselves. They would watch the videos we recorded, and they would read select chapters of the book, then come to lecture, where we would discuss these ideas that they learned about. But before that, they would fill out a quiz so that we make sure that they are prepared to have these conversations. And after the lecture, they were just going into the practical tasks. So they worked on their practical tasks in a computer lab where they were, for example, training different machine learning models, or they were just sometimes interacting with chatbots or building very simple chatbots themselves. And during this, they were working towards a report that they did every module based on their practical tasks. And then they also went to the Blackboard lab sessions where they could work on the tasks, just pen and paper, calculating probabilities, looking into truth tables, similar tasks, and working still on the lab reports. At the end of the week or module, they would just submit the lab reports, some of which they were working in groups. That was an important part, that some of the tasks were a bit too difficult for individuals, so we were giving them to groups. And they were also submitting self-reflection reports where they would tell us what they did during the module, what they learned from it, and what they will do differently in the future. So this is the framework where we were injecting the teach-back method. So the teach-back method, I could essentially, the way we implemented it, I could essentially just describe it as students gathering in these groups that I have just mentioned before, and they explain different concepts to each other. So for this, for each week, we came up with a list of concepts. Students in their groups chose what they want to explain to the others. They prepared for it, and then they were taking turns in explaining things to each other, but in a way that this wasn't a mandatory task. So they had the option to be part of this or just forego this task. So the way we were injecting it to the structure was as follows. So first, we came up with the concepts and initial questions that we wanted the students to discuss, and we took this to the lecture. In the beginning of the lecture, we just asked the students, please, if you meet a concept that you think that would be particularly interesting or particularly difficult for you, just note it down. So our hope was that with this, we can induce more active cognitive processing by making the students to take notes and not just take notes of verbatim what we were saying, but selectively, just the concepts that they were interested in. And then at the end of the lecture, we asked them to vote. It was a Mentimeter vote, and we took those votes and used them to fine-tune the original concepts that we had, sometimes adding things or just leaving things as they are. So then when they went to the Blackboard session much later, they already prepared from these concepts and then were explaining them to each other. So just an example of how this process went from the original concept to the end product. Sometimes we had some question originally, and the student questions were fitting already in quite nicely, so they didn't really add something more, so we just kept the original question. Or in other cases, students didn't really have questions in that line of thinking. They didn't really have questions about that concept. So then, again, we kept the same question. But sometimes it happened that we didn't really prepare concepts or questions for certain topics. And then, based on the student questions, we were adding new things that we asked students to prepare about and discuss with each other. We were evaluating the outcomes and the effect of the teachback method in two main ways. One is the mandatory course survey that we do after every iteration of the courses, where students are asked different questions, and on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, they say how much they agree with the statement or question, and during the oral exam. We had three target areas that we were trying to evaluate. One was confidence and experience, the other understanding and retention, and the third is engagement. And when I discuss the results, I will tell a bit more about what I mean about these areas. So when it comes to the results, first, let us look at confidence and experience. So we were actually looking at two different things here. One is about daring to ask. So in the lecture, it can be a problem that students may not dare to ask questions, maybe because there's a large audience for them, or there's an authority figure standing and explaining to them. So what we thought was that maybe if they practice before during these teachback sessions, when one of the other students is explaining and they realize that there isn't really anything scary about asking these questions and I don't understand something. And so this hopefully would build up their confidence for later to ask questions from us. And we had this question in the survey whether they think that this happened, whether they think that now they have more confidence in asking questions. And here, only 2 students answered, and this was unfortunately a bit of a shortcoming of the survey, because the survey is there after every iteration of the course, but it's not mandatory, which means that in our case, almost 60 students we had in the class, but only 6 students actually answered the questions, and only 3 of them answered the questions about teachback, because only 3 of them actually engaged in the teachback activities. So in this case, only 2 students answered, but they either strongly agreed or agreed with the proposition that now they are more daring to ask. And when it comes to experience, our hope was that through practicing explaining things to each other, students would then come more experienced and more prepared to the oral exam. So we hope that there would be a lower rate of failing. And this is actually what we found. So in 2021, we had a failing rate which doesn't really show of 25%. And in 2022, it fell down to 21%, which is not a very big difference. And there were also other changes that we made in the course, but still it seemed promising result. And when it comes to understanding and retention, we were actually looking at 3 different things. One, that we were hoping that students would gain a better understanding by listening to different kinds of explanations. So not just from us, but from each other. And also they would get a better understanding because they were preparing for the explanations and they were making the explanations. And also we were hoping that students would remember these concepts better because they were making these explanations, similarly to how I remembered better different concepts because I was teaching it to them. And one reason I grouped these questions together, because the answers were almost not completely identical for all 3 of them. So out of the 3 students who were engaging in teachback and who were also answering the questions, 2 of them said that they strongly agree that they had a better understanding and they had a better retention. And when it comes to engagement, we were for one hoping that students would find this activity engaging and interesting, and also because of the very compressed time frame of the course, 8 weeks, they were essentially expected that they would spend 20 hours every week on just this one course. So we were hoping that if we give them other ways to interact with the course, other ways to engage with the course, for example, preparing for these teachback sessions, then we could increase the time they spent with the course to this expectation. Otherwise, if it's just preparing the same way that they would do, maybe it's difficult to just read and read more if there isn't really a target that we put there, which is you have to be able to explain it to the other students. So for the first question, we had very good feedback, quite positive, that all of the students who were participating in Teachback strongly agreed that this was a very engaging and interesting activity. And for the other question, we didn't really have any conclusive results, unfortunately, and we believe that this was partially because the question wasn't really well formulated, in the sense that we asked them if they spent much time with preparing to the back teaching sessions, and then much time is very subjective. So students just couldn't answer positively or negatively. We also had a few exam testimonials. As I said, we were trying to evaluate the teachback method during the exam, which also meant that we were asking students about what they thought about the teachback method, and we had positive feedback. They said that it was really helpful. Others said that sometimes it was good, sometimes not as good, but they also found it helpful, and others stopped after a while or never actually engaged in the teachback activity. So to go to the last part, which is how we would move forward with the teachback and what our future could be, we would like to improve teachback and also increase the student participation in it. So, for example, we could start earlier. I mentioned that we had initial questions very early, but only shared these questions after the lecture, which meant that students didn't have a lot of time to prepare between the lecture and the Blackboard session. So the initial questions we could share already, and then when students add some more at the lecture, we add those questions. We could also extend the question list, because we already have a list of example questions for the oral exam that students can use to prepare for the exam. We could share those as well and ask students to use that in teachback, or we could just return to explaining concepts where students wouldn't really try to answer certain questions to each other, but really explain the concepts themselves and use the questions, or maybe other students would ask these questions that are related to the concept as a tool to help in these explanations. And also we could move the teachback from the Blackboard session to dedicated group meetings where students book for themselves the study rooms that are available at campus. So they take their education more in their own hands and organize these meetings for themselves. And we could also make teachback mandatory for a week, for example, so that we make sure that every student can make an informed decision whether they want to continue the teachback or not. Because if they never try it, then there's a good chance that they will not continue with it. And we could also have some mock teachback sessions where we essentially model how they could do the teachback themselves in the class. And another goal we have, and here I don't really have a planned solution of what we could do, is increase the feedback. So one question that we had is how we could get more feedback from the course survey, which unfortunately is an open question still for not only us, but many others at our university who would really like to see more results from these course evaluation surveys that we do essentially every year. So here, I think it would be also interesting to have some discussions with those who are interested, not only how teachback could be improved later, but also about your experiences when it comes to the course surveys. that you may also have at your universities. But that was all from me, and thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have questions and time.